Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Noah Gordon, and I co-direct the Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics Program here at Carnegie. We're here today to talk about good news in a climate crisis. But before we get into the good stuff, I'll say a few words about that climate crisis. We just had the hottest summer in recorded history, likely the hottest in over 120,000 years. The oceans are dangerously hot too, and we're seeing extreme weather events linked to climate change, from heat domes in the American South, to forest fires in Canada and Europe, to flooding in Delhi and Beijing. We haven't even yet started addressing the source of the problem, the greenhouse gases we pump into the atmosphere. Global emissions have never been higher because we've never burned more coal nor more oil than we did in 2022. We're not on track to keep warming below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. So there's a lot of work to do over the coming decades. But succumbing to gloom and doom doesn't help anybody either. And indeed, it would be dishonest to act as if our climate story is one of unmitigated catastrophe, as if there's no chance for future generations to live better lives than we do. Here's one data point that cheers me up. Just 10 years ago, it was plausible that we could end up living on a hellscape with 4 degrees of warming or even more. But thanks to progress on clean energy, humanity is now on track to cause between 2 and 3 degrees of warming. Far too much, but much better than the worst case scenario. So there are many positive signs like that, and the next 45 minutes are a chance to focus on them. We'll have about 35 minutes of moderated discussion with our two great guests before we turn to questions from you, the audience, for the last 10 minutes. Please use a YouTube chat to ask your questions and include your name and affiliation. So let's introduce those guests now. Here's Hannah Ritchie. Hannah is Deputy Editor and Lead Researcher at Our World in Data and a researcher at the Oxford Martin Program in Global Development. She's the author of the forthcoming book, Not the End of the World, How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet. Hannah, welcome.
Thanks, great to be here.
And here's our second guest, Assaad Razzouk. Assaad is a Lebanese-British clean energy entrepreneur, author, podcaster, and commentator based in Singapore. He hosts the Angry Clean Energy Guy podcast, and he's the author of the book, Saving the Planet Without the Bullshit, What They Don't Tell You About the Climate Crisis. Assaad, welcome. You're muted, but we'll have you back soon. All right, let's get right into the good news. The International Energy Agency just released its latest net zero roadmap, and Director Fatih Birol says the clean energy transition is on the cusp of a historic turning point. Assaad, what does he mean by that?
Well, he's right in a way. The International Energy Agency is famous for being very late at catching the direction of travel in terms of where the global electrification is going. They thankfully caught up quite a bit in the last 2 years, but I think they're still quite behind the curve in some ways. And the one thing that every year is going to happen is that the International Energy Agency is going to revise their forecasts for clean energy and electric cars and batteries up. But they have now smelled the coffee, so to speak, and they have figured out something that many others have not yet, which is that electrification is happening. It's actually happened, really. And now it's a question of maybe waiting out the next 7 to 10 years for everyone to see that we're getting closer to 80 or 90% renewables across the board, 80, 90% new cars being electrical, and scooters and buses and three-wheelers, etc.
That's a really important point, that low carbon technology is getting cheaper and better even faster than top analysts have expected. Hannah, over to you. Anything from you on IEA research or macro trends in the transition? And why is the IEA more positive now than it was just 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think Assad's right that historically the joke is that you take the IEA projections of low carbon technologies and you double or triple them, because they've consistently been very pessimistic on these technologies. And I think this new report is not just a one-off, like they've just finally come to this realization. I think they have been gradually getting there. Like a couple of weeks ago, we had a report looking at what their expectations were for fossil fuels, and the previous projection was that we might reach peak fossil fuels this decade in terms of like aggregate, so like adding up coal, oil, and gas. They've then switched that to, they think all three individually will peak this decade. So you do see this gradual shift of they're becoming much more optimistic about the role of low carbon technologies. I think one thing that's just also become very clear and was very clear in the new recent report is the framing of whether this transition is going to be extremely expensive or whether it's actually going to be an investment that saves costs. So their projection is that by 2050, we will actually save, I think the estimate was 12 trillion, taking out to get completely disregarding like climate externalities or air pollution externalities, just in pure economic costs. They're now framing it as this low carbon transition is a short-term investment with a long-term payoff. And I think that's quite a significant shift than we've had previously, where climate action was always framed as are you going to sacrifice the economy for this moral reason to address climate change? And I think that's shifting a lot.
That's an important point, and we'll come back to that in a minute. No, one encouraging piece from that report, just 2 years ago, the IEA said that half of the technology we need to eliminate net emissions by 2050 wasn't even on the market. And now that number is already down to 35% thanks to progress on electrolyzers and sodium-ion batteries. Assaad, is there a particular technology that jumps out to you as a reason to be optimistic?
Noah, first of all, we have 100% of the technologies that we need, and they really have to stop with these percentages because they're meaningless. Second, a lot of people, me included, called out the International Energy Agency 3 or 4 years ago because, in fact, when they publish these things, unfortunately, these become dogma to ministries of energy and planning in multiple countries. I mean, in most countries around the world, right? Because effectively, most bureaucracies around the world start planning their own energy systems based on what the IEA says is going to happen next year or the year after. And the problem is that if you're consistently wrong, what's happening is that you're skewing that planning effectively away from, or you're slowing down the transformation, so to speak. So they really have to stop with this technology stuff because we have all the solar technology that we need. We've got all the wind technology that we need. We've got the batteries. We've got the electric cars, scooters. We've got green steel even. We've got what we need for cement. We've got the electrolyzers. It's not a matter of having technology. Now, what we don't have is what we're never going to have, which is all the carbon capture, greenwashing tech, which we don't need to start with. It would be far better if we were entirely concentrated on bringing down the costs of what we have than being distracted with that other stuff. So they really need to stop. So,
Hannah, I want to pick up on a term you used in your TED Talk, the recording of which was just released. The term is decoupling. We hear this word in many contexts, the US and Chinese economies diverging, the Baltic states leaving the Russian power grid, even celebrity breakups. But what do you mean by decoupling, and why is it good climate news?
So what I mean by decoupling is where you get a break in the relationship between economic growth and, in this case, a change in carbon emissions. So if you look historically, and actually that's still the case across a lot of the world today, you get this very strong positive relationship where the higher the GDP, the higher the CO2 emissions. So the richer you are, the more energy you can consume, the more you can travel, the more stuff you buy. So the richer that you are, the higher your emissions. And that has been true historically. And that's obviously a problem because then the problem is framed as, are you going to sacrifice economic growth to reduce your carbon emissions? And for many countries across the world, that's just political suicide. A leader cannot stand up and say, we will deliberately, purposely retract the economy in order to reduce emissions. They probably will not get elected, unfortunately. So the positive news is that over the last few decades, especially in rich countries, we have seen a decoupling of these metrics. So if you take the UK or the US or many countries across Europe, GDP has continued to go up while CO2 emissions have come down steeply, which tells us that these two things are not incompatible. We can achieve both at the same time. Now, the big concern for people there is, so if you take the UK, for example, it's almost halved its emissions, CO2 emissions, since 1990. And the concern is maybe they're just offshoring these emissions to other countries across the world. But we can account for this offshoring. And when you do account for the offshoring, emissions are higher in the UK than they are just based on domestic emissions. So we are an importer. But we still see this very significant decline in emissions, even when we account for this offshoring. So it's not the case that this is only explained by the fact that we're like shipping our emissions elsewhere. And I think for me, this is just like a very clear change in the narrative, where we don't need to frame it as you can have one or the other. The point is you can actually do both at the same time.
Yeah, and the question of whether decoupling is possible globally really informs the debate about degrowth, the idea that the only way to avoid destroying the planet is to stop economic growth, at least in some places. But I think we need a whole other podcast to have that debate just at the moment.
I think like one point to add there is like, although this decoupling is happening, like I've heard no one make the claim that it's happening fast enough. It's not happening fast enough, but it is there, and we need to push forward on it.
Totally. It's hard to keep the bad news even out of a good climate news event. Assaad, I've also seen you describe lawsuits against major polluters as good climate news, and you're on the board of the legal group Client Earth. What's the good news about these climate lawsuits? What's happening?
Well, we have a dynamic where we have an incumbent industry with tentacles across pretty much all our lives and everything that we do, which is making hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and then plowing those billions into defending its market position, spending upward of $200 or $500 million a year on propaganda for fossil fuels. And that is slowing the necessary transformation of our economies into, to deliver clean, fueled lifestyles, so to speak. Now, when you think about what are the big levers that could change that, it's very hard to disregard the courts. So the courts are, at least as far as I'm concerned, one of the top 2 or 3 levers to effect systemic top-down change. And we've seen that already happen through court decisions. So there's almost nothing more important than launching thousands of lawsuits, pretty much everywhere around the world, on the grounds of fossil fuel companies and states breaking things like securities law and environmental law and right to life and right to clean air and what have you. And this is a movement that is accelerating now and should be a big cause of optimism, because there is no way that the court systems in multiple countries are all going to just shut down because oil companies want them to shut down. And so expect major breakthroughs through the courts this decade.
That's encouraging news, certainly. Hannah, anything from you on lawsuits, or alternatively, is there a technology where the falling cost and improved performance really encourages you over the last couple of years?
I mean, I can go back to the particular technologies. I mean, it's like very hard for me to pick one. There's been many that like have been very impressive. I think one, like a big transition for me has been in transport and electric vehicles. I think if you look at, for rich countries where most of the CO2 reductions have come from so far, it's been electricity. So the UK, for example, used to burn tons of coal. Basically, it's gone now. And a big part of that has been the emergence of solar and wind and other renewable technologies, where the world has made much less progress, and we basically have not reduced emissions at all as in transport. But I think that's now changing, and that's changing because of the rise of electric vehicles. And there, I think there's been 2 massive shifts. The biggest shift has been the fall of cost. So if you look at the price of lithium-ion batteries, like since 1990, the prices have fallen by like more than 98%, and they continue to fall. So the problem of electric vehicles is, even if you go back a decade, they were like far, far too expensive for most people across the world to buy. And they're now getting to the stage where the lifetime cost of an electric car is actually better than a petrol or diesel. And we are getting quite close to the stage where the upfront cost is competitive. And I actually don't think it will be too long before the upfront cost of electric car will be lower than petrol and diesel. So it'll just be the economic choice for people to make. I think the other big change is just the advancement of the technology itself. So if you look at the average range of electric cars like a decade ago, so maybe like 2011 or so, the average range you were like looking at like 70 miles. Since then, it's like more than tripled. So you've had this like massive cost decline, so it's affordable, but you've also just had this massive advancement of how good these technologies are. People were not going to buy electric cars when you could only get 70 miles out of them. They are going to buy them when you can get 250, 300, 350 miles out of them. So for me, that's just been like a massive change over the last decade, especially because with transport emissions, we've kind of just been this like really stagnant or growing emissions. And until we've like hit this electric vehicle tipping point, progress there seemed extremely unlikely.
It's been mostly bad climate news out of the UK this month, with the government rolling back climate targets, slowing the transition to heat pumps, and cancelling high-speed rail to Manchester. So it's nice to get a reminder of all the achievements. And I mean, the UK coal exit has been a remarkable thing. I want to turn to agriculture, which I sort of think is the final frontier of climate politics. It's hardly touched by the IPCC or climate policymakers, even though livestock alone produce about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. I saw an infographic from your organization, Hannah Arwold, and data yesterday showing that humans slaughter 140,000 chickens every minute for food, which boggles the mind when you think of the welfare of those animals, let alone the environmental cost. But back to the good news. Is there a positive trend from agriculture? Are we getting more efficient in making food, something to be encouraged about?
I'm going to quickly touch on the bad news first, because I think just like food in general is just an underrated problem, as you alluded to. I think one point is the climate aspect of it, where emissions from food systems as a whole are responsible for between a quarter and a third of our emissions. So we can't ignore them. They're a massive part of climate change. But beyond that, if we look at our other environmental problems, like they're a leading driver of deforestation, they're a leading driver of biodiversity loss, they're the largest user of fresh water. We use half of the world's habitable land for farming. Like there's nearly no environmental problems that food does not sit very close to the center of. But the good news is that if we start to address the food system and many of the solutions, you get multiple benefits at the same time. So you can actually improve deforestation, land use, biodiversity, climate with single actions, which is the good news. I think on the good news front, I think what's probably quite underrated is just how productive the global food system is now. I think we struggle to grapple with the numbers in terms of how much food we actually produce. I think because we still have nearly 1 in 9 people in the world that don't get enough food to eat, we might have this perception that, we just about produce enough food for everyone. Some people have a little bit more than they should. Some people don't get enough. The reality is that we probably produce like at least 5,000 calories per person per day. The problem is not that we can't produce enough food in aggregate. The key problem is that, one, the global distribution of that food, but also there's just like massive inefficiencies from like what we grow out of the field to like what ends up on people's plate. And that's one of those is just like standard food chain losses and waste. The other big one is the inefficiency of converting that into meat. So we feed a lot of our grain and our crops to animals, and we get very little out in return. And then we also put the stuff in cars. So to me, that might sound like negative news, but for me, that's quite positive news. Like our problem is not global aggregate food production. And we could be in a position where if climate change hits agriculture production and crop yields, the global food system should be relatively resilient to that. It's more a problem of distribution and the choices we make about how we want to use the food that we grow. In terms of positive developments on the technological front, there's obviously many developments in alternative proteins and meat substitutes where we could get to the stage where we can basically completely eliminate like all of the losses, all of the cereals and crops that we feed to livestock very inefficiently. So it is possible that we can easily feed the world 8, 9, 10 billion people and reduce our environmental impacts at the same time.
That's certainly good news that we already produce enough calories for everyone, even while feeding so many grain crops to cars and livestock. Assaad, I know from your book you've tried cell-cultivated chicken in Singapore. How did it taste, and what do you hope for from innovation like that?
Look, the good news on the agricultural front is amazingly good, but it's going to need a bit of time. And it's for the same reason as the electrification trend, took some time, which is learning curves and costs effectively dropping, right? So the chicken that I tried in Singapore is made using a precision organic fermentation. So there's no actual chicken involved. There's only chicken DNA. You don't slaughter a chicken, and the chicken doesn't eat anything. Now imagine if that was scaled up, right? So imagine the amount of land that you would free up globally if that was scaled up. And the good news on that front is it's being scaled up. Frankly, that chicken that I had was exactly like your typical chicken that you would eat. It was presented in multiple different ways with multiple different sauces. And you'd have to be very, very finicky to kind of just invent a difference between that and, physical chicken. But this issue of precision fermentation is almost never in the debate. It's incredibly huge, and it's going to lead to planetary consequences. Because imagine if we did not need 30 billion chicken, or however many chicken we keep alive at any point in time across the world. I think it's something like 30 billion. Imagine if you didn't need these 30 billion chicken. Just imagine how much crops and land you would free up for other uses. But that is where we're going. And it's just a matter of cost, because once that chicken that I tasted in Singapore is cheaper than the other chicken, then everybody's going to eat it, or at least you'll have a premium category. Let's call it real chicken. But then 90% of my calories per year will be from the precision fermentation chicken and beef and everything else protein. So
Yeah, I think yeah.
Big concentration of good news in ag, which, as you said, doesn't really get enough, time. Sorry, Hannah.
No, sure. Yeah, I think as you said, like I think for the food stuff, just like the energy stuff, like cost is the critical factor. People are not going to buy it if it's more expensive than conventional meat. And I think there the focus needs to be on giving people exactly the same experience as they currently have. I think where food differs slightly at the moment from the energy transition is that for most people, they might care a little bit about where their energy comes from. Like they might be opposed to a wind farm outside their window. But for most people, they just want to plug their socket into the wall and they want cheap electricity out. And that takes away like very individual choices about what energy source you're getting out. Like it's in terms of a macro level, it's about building an energy system that gives people cheap electricity. I think where food currently is quite different is that people really care naturally about what they're putting in their bodies. And it comes down to individual choices they're making every meal, every snack, which is where I think there is this combination of one, yes, getting the technologies and the cost comparable with what they'd normally eat, but also being able to provide them with the same nutrition, same experience as they'd have otherwise. Otherwise, I think we're going to hit like a big barrier there in terms of behavioral shift.
No, that's well said, both of you. As soon as it's cheaper to have cell-cultivated chicken, which is now available here in DC, and you have to pay $2 extra to have a real chicken slaughtered, I think it's hard to imagine people asking the waiter for that. And Hannah, it also reminds me of, in your TED Talk, you talk about your brother buying an electric car, and it's not because he does it for the sake of the climate. It's because it's a better product, and you see that happening in places like Texas in the US, which produces more renewable electricity than any other state, and it's not because of their special devotion to the Paris Agreement. I want to have a regional question for both of you. We're speaking today from the US and the UK, rich countries where emissions and GDP are decoupling, and where the climate debate often dwells on how Asian economies like India and China burn so much coal that domestic actions are irrelevant. Maybe starting with Assaad, I know you're based in Singapore. Do you have a data point or trend that shows good climate news coming out of Asia?
I do. Plenty. I mean, the good climate news coming out of Asia is really just numerous. I'll give you maybe 3 data points. The first one is, if you look at what's actually really happening in China, what you'll see is that China has is very close, I would say, if not already at peak emissions. So its emissions are plateauing, which means, in other words, that 100% of new demand for energy is going to come from renewables in China. Um, if not now, then very soon. I'm talking 1, maybe 2, at the outset, 3 years. The same exact situation is in India with a lag. So India will get there by probably 2035, but that's also a matter of the fact that the Indians just have more to catch up on in terms of energy intensity, right? Just to keep the lights on for everybody and keep everyone warm and with a roof over their head and things like that. So that's China and then India. In the rest of Asia, I'll give you a personal experience. Um, if you look at my, my day job, which is to run a renewable energy business that's headquartered in Singapore and that's Pan-Asian, what we thought was going to happen 4 years ago is completely different from what actually happened. We didn't think there was going to be much business in, say, Thailand or the Philippines or Singapore or Indonesia or Malaysia. But then we had two shocks in the region, mostly due to the Ukraine war, which made everybody wake up to the fact that natural gas is something that you bring from abroad to burn. And then once you've burned it, you have to bring some more when you're endowed with all this sun and wind. And then the second thing is the prices of things like natural gas and oil and coal are all over the place. And therefore, your consumers, your citizens, need a lot of support when things go out of whack somewhere else. And so these countries are transforming far more rapidly to renewables than even they or I thought possible, and I'm an optimist, 4 years ago.
That's really encouraging news. Hannah, what about you? And is there anything from Asia, or maybe even from where you are in Europe, that should encourage our listeners?
I mean, I think there's lots of stuff about across Europe and North America, but I think like the question of Asian economies is really crucial, because I mean the big pushback I get in the UK whenever you talk about emissions reduction is like, why should we, like, we're only 1% of global emissions, like what about China? Like, this is all about focus your energy elsewhere because that's where all the emissions are coming from. And I think my response to that is like, you can turn the but China around and say, but China is building renewables way faster than any other country in the world. They're building nuclear way faster than any country in the world. They're really going for it on electric vehicles. So more than 1 in 3 new cars in China now is electric, which is far above the European average, far above the UK. So in all of these technologies, China is now moving extremely fast. And as I said, we are getting to the point where China is hitting up against what we might expect to be a peak in its emissions, which is, I think, it's set a target for 2030. So it's years ahead of schedule. And that's because renewables are growing so quickly that they're basically almost completely meeting electricity demand. And when it completely meets electricity demand, it just won't burn more coal. It's just more costly for China to burn more coal. So I think there's lots of positive stories there. And I think India, again, is the same, where I actually think India's pathway will be even lower carbon than China's has been, and China's has been lower carbon than the US or Europe. So I think there's just like a cascade of positive news stories there, where I think the further and further you go down the income scale, the faster and better this transition will be.
All right, peak emissions are on the way. Assaad, you're no hopeless optimist. You've got a book on saving the planet without the bullshit, that means greenwashing, and a podcast where you're the angry clean energy guy. But you also do a weekly Twitter thread of climate good news. When did you start doing this, and why do you think it's important?
Well, I detected, on my social media that years ago, that there is a lot of people that are just depressed or concerned about climate. And I have kids like everybody else, and I can see their friends and how they talk about that topic and what have you. It was clear to me that the whole narrative on climate is not maybe sufficiently positive for people to actually turn around and take action. right? Because ultimately, everybody needs to take action. If you just depress people all day long, then they won't. They'll just go about their daily lives and forget about the climate and just assume there's nothing they can do to affect it. So I started, dribbling out these kind of good climate news over 3 years ago. Must have been almost 4 years ago now, on Twitter, where every Sunday I just summarize the week in 240 characters, and then I add to that thread so that you can keep on clicking basically until you've recovered from whatever depressed state you are, because the quantum of good climate news is actually enormous. I mean, in the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act is the most consequential climate legislation in the history of the world. The Europeans are moving mountains. We've just discussed the Asians. It's just a question of everyone taking perhaps more action, because what we need to go faster. That's what we need. We've already gone. Now we've got to just go faster.
Hannah, the title of your TED Talk asks, are we the last generation or the first sustainable one? And the words last generation jumped out to me because that's the name of one of Europe's most active climate protest groups, Letzte Generation, from Germany and Austria. They've been blocking roads, vandalizing cars and art for the noble cause of protecting the planet. And there are other climate protest groups with radical names like Extinction Rebellion. We use our Carnegie Climate Protest Tracker to track these activities around the world. But what do you think is the right balance between warning about the end of the world at a time when we need to go faster, as Assaad says, and pointing out how human well-being continues to improve? What does it mean to be the first sustainable generation?
Yeah, so what I mean by the first sustainable generation is, for me, sustainability has two halves. So we often naturally focus on the half which is don't destroy the environment for future generations, and I would also include other species in that. Which is a valid definition. But for me, there's also another half to that, which is we also need to meet the needs of the current generation at the same time. Like, that's the standard kind of UN sustainable development definition. So we need to provide a good life for everyone around today, and we also need to do it in a way that we don't degrade the environment for future generations. And the point is we need to do both at the same time. Why I frame it as why we could be the first sustainable generation, as I don't think we've ever achieved both at the same time. There have been generations historically which have had a low environmental footprint, but if you look at many of the human well-being metrics, they were not good. So the key example I give is if you look at child mortality, for most of human history, half of children died before reaching puberty. Now, to me, that's not meeting the needs of the current generation. And you can look at any kind of human well-being metric, whether it's child mortality, life expectancy, extreme poverty, education. There's such a long list where we've just seen rapid improvements over the last few centuries. But you've seen the environmental metrics go in the opposite direction. So we've done a lot better in the first half at the sacrifice of the second half. And my framing is that I think we could be the first generation that actually does achieve both at the same time. We can meet the needs of the current generation, and we can reduce our environmental footprint at the same time. Now, in terms of how you strike that balance with waking people up to the urgency of the problem, for me, it's just about, in terms of the framing of the messaging, is getting multiple messages across at the same time. So yes, we need to really be clear that these are extremely urgent problems, very important problems, lives are at stake here. Like, we really need to get moving on this, and we need to get moving quickly. So in that sense, I think that the work of activist groups have been absolutely crucial in raising awareness of these problems and driving urgency. I think what's important for me to pair with that is, one, you need to be concerned to take action on it. But I think you also just need to be very clear and show signs of progress along the way. There's no point of just scaring people about these problems without also matching that with a sense of agency that there is actually something that we can do about it. So it's saying, yes, these problems are serious and urgent, but look, we are making progress, and you can come and join us so we can push that much further. So I think these two thoughts, we need to somehow combine them together.
I feel more hopeful already. And do check out Hannah's TED Talk for more on that subject. I have one more question for each of you before we turn to the audience questions that are coming in. One way to talk about good news is to debunk a piece of bad news. And, Assaad, sometimes people act as if by switching from fossil fuels to electricity, we're just replacing oil and gas extraction with the extraction of minerals like lithium, nickel, and copper. Could you compare the mineral and mining requirements of a decarbonized world with the world we have today?
Well, let me use one of Hannah's analysis to do that. The fossil fuel economy requires something like 535, Hannah, if I'm correct, 535 times more minerals and associated commodities than a clean energy economy. Yes, look, there's a lot of these types of statements out there, but I would like to emphasize that a lot of that propaganda that you hear, starting from wind turbines kill birds to or cats, whichever one it was, to minerals used by electric cars, to DRC mining, which is a very serious issue, but not limited to the clean energy economy, that are actually manufactured by documented astroturfing and oil trolls around the world and then spread with oil and gas money to the public. It's critically important that we debunk them at every possibility and that we spread actually the facts, which is why I'm citing Hannah's numbers.
Hannah has all the best data. It's a really astonishing number about the mining requirements, 535 times less. Hannah, any myths you want to debunk for us? Any good news?
I mean, I think there's a lot of them. I think what's important to note here, and I actually see it coming from both sides. One is climate deniers or fossil fuel proponents trying to debunk renewables or other technologies, but I also see it from the other side, where it's this striving to find the absolute perfect solution, and if the solution is not absolutely perfect, then we shouldn't do it. Yes, these technologies require minerals. Yes, they require some energy to build them, but they're like far, far, far better than the current system that they already have. Like, some of the risk here is that we wait and wait and wait until we find just the perfect solution, which was never going to come. And then we've just completely delayed the problem. We have the solutions there. They are much better than the fossil fuel alternatives, and we need to get moving on them. I think the biggest risk is that we wait for this utopia solution to come along that just solves all of the problems at one time, and it's just not going to. Like, we really need to get moving on this, and to that we need to accept that we will need some minerals and we will need some energy to build it, but it's very much worth it.
Well said. Let's bring in the audience now. We have two questions on the younger generations. Maybe we can start with Assaad. We have Kaylee from the Frost Center from the Environment ask if you have any tips to combat climate anxiety, especially for a younger audience who feels the climate crisis is crippling. Maybe there's something, you mentioned your kids. Any tips on climate anxiety?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to, first of all, be cognizant of the good climate news out there. But then the second thing is to take action. Now, there's nothing more therapeutic than doing something about it, right? So if you are able to, you should either back an NGO which is doing something that you feel is meaningful, and I would suggest that, for example, the litigation space is the climate litigation space is a very good one. Or you should protest, because peaceful protests have an incredibly important place to play in effecting continuous change, because we need to still move society as a whole beyond where it is, and protests are a fantastic form. And then communication. You should also communicate to all those around you. Nothing like talking about it to relieve climate anxiety and then acting.
Hannah, I think we sort of heard you on the subject, so I'll give you the next question. We've been mostly talking about technological progress or changes in observable metrics because those are the most concrete, but we have a question here about how the media is covering climate change. The question is the media covering it in ways that are more accessible to wider audiences? And I'll maybe add, do you think the media is doing a better job of using data to tell the right story?
Yeah, I think the media is getting much better. One is just that they are covering climate change much more, which I think is incredibly important. I think it's largely true that accessibility is getting better. I think one reservation I get, and there's obviously massive variation in how the media covers climate change. I think we still have a slight gap between how we communicate metrics and how that translates into what it actually means for people. I think many of the metrics we would use to measure climate change, whether that's CO2 in the atmosphere or temperatures or radiative forcing, I think for most people there is still this massive gap of how they translate these graphs into like what it actually means for them on the ground. Like how does this actually impact my life? What will my life look like a decade from now? And just a graph of saying we're at 1.4 degrees just doesn't do that. And neither does endless headlines of it's 1.4, it's 1.5, it's 1.6. Like that, for me, there's still a significant gap in translating these metrics into like just like tangible answers to like how this will actually affect things on the ground. But I think in general, media is improving. And I think one final point is that I will always say this, that I think we should just put also a lot more emphasis on solutions and and what's the good stuff that's happening. I think it's important to flag the disasters that are happening, the bad stuff, but I think we also need to pair it with the bad stuff is happening, but here's some good news and how can we drive that trend forward.
We have another question here about how transforming the global energy system to reduce carbon emissions wouldn't just stop global warming, but would also have huge co-benefits. Assaad, what are some of the benefits in other areas we might see from a transition to cleaner energy?
Well, where do I start? I mean, the extraction and burning of oil, gas, and coal, is behind, I don't know how many wars this century to start with. So that's kind of minus wars, right there. That's millions of deaths that are due to that commodity or those commodities. Number two, this is being done in the oceans. This is being done in our backyards, but this is also being done, together with in forested areas around the world, and it's destroying ecosystems, across the board. Number three, there is the pollution and the health impact of fossil fuels, which is basically killing us, right? I mean, it's already killing 7-8 million people a year, and that's just the stuff that we know of. So, for example, microplastics, we don't even know just yet how they're going to kill us, but I can tell you they will kill us. And the quantity of microplastics that's due to burning oil, gas, and coal is in the trillions of particles. So there is a whole, everybody from insects to oceans and everything in them, including us, is going to feel a lot better if we just stop burning oil, gas, and coal.
If you needed more reasons to get rid of fossil fuels, Assaad just gave them to you. It's not just about the emissions. Our final question of the day is for Hannah. Someone's asking, what climate-related areas need more data and research from organizations like Our World in Data?
I think a big understanding and data gap for us is more on I think we have lots of data on the technologies and how these technologies are emerging. I think there's lots of people working on that. Where I think the data gaps are like really understanding, translating from temperature rise or precipitation patterns to like actual human impacts. So what are the impacts going to be on agriculture? Like for me, that's the biggest risk of climate change, is the impact on agriculture. How do people respond to heat stress under a range of different conditions? That research to me is not clear. So I think by far for me the biggest gap is translating the like very physical climate impacts into like how it actually affects human populations.
With that, we are out of time for our event on good news in a climate crisis. So first of all, thanks to Hannah. Be sure to check out Hannah's forthcoming book, Not the End of the World, How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet. And Our World in Data has all the infographics to back up what we've been saying today about technological progress and other areas. And thanks to Assaad. Be sure to read his book, Saving the Planet Without the Bullshit, and listen to his podcast, The Angry Clean Energy Guy. And of course, thanks to you, the audience, for spending your time with us today. See you next time. Bye-bye.